Yeah, good afternoon all again. Thank you all for joining us for the March Journal Club series. It gives me great pleasure to invite my friend and colleague, Dr. Raidan, for this month's Journal Club. She'll be speaking on some of the guidelines that have been developed by the endodontists. They have developed a number of guidelines for case reports, laboratory studies, animal studies. And the one Dr. Raidan is going to speak on is on randomized control trials, in which endodontic randomized control trials. I'll hand it over to her.
Thank you, Nibo, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your presence. And today, a lecture about the PRIRATE guidelines for reporting randomized clinical trial in endodontics. Before that, let me touch on various aspects related to the lecture or to the topic in short. So it is difficult to go in depth in such topic. So evidence-based dentistry is an approach to oral healthcare that require integration of patient's history, oral and medical condition, dentist clinical experience, and patient's need and preferences, with the assessment of systematic and or with the assessment or systematic assessment of clinically relevant evidence base. In terms of primary research studies, randomized clinical trial provide the highest level of evidence because of its unbiased study design and minimum or no systematic error. Individual randomized controlled trial and subsequently systematic review of several trials should ideally underpin the clinical decision making. So what is randomized controlled trial? It is the type of the study in which the sample size of population of interest is randomly assigned to one or two interventions or control groups. And then these groups are treated and observed in an identical manner over a period of time. Then at the end of the study, the groups are evaluated in terms of the outcomes that's it at the beginning of the trial. Then the results of this assessment would compare with each other. So how can we design and conduct randomized clinical trial? We need a research team that will work together, clinical researcher, statistician, investigator, so all of them will work together, and we need to design or formulate properly the question of the study using the framework of PCOD. Also, the project should be approved by the ethical committee or the organization host to ensure that everything is properly done related to the research subject, including the informed consent. We need also to register the research study in a database website. Inclusion and exclusion criteria should be carefully determined and should be strike a balance between generalizability and minimization of bias. Criteria with or that have a narrow criteria with narrow may create challenges in determining the population sample, and this will result in less generalizability or result in less generalizability. And if the criteria is so wide, this will create challenges when detecting the correct or the true effect of the intervention for the given group. Randomization in the in randomized clinical trial is very important, and this is the allocation of patients to study groups by chance, and this can be done by generation of allocation sequence. This could be simple, block, or stratified. In simple allocation, the randomization is unrestricted and the groups are inequally sized, maybe. But in block randomization, the groups will be equally sized. In stratified randomization, factors such as age, sex are randomized separately and then distributed equally amongst the group. Concealment of allocation, this means that the person who generates the random assignment remain unaware to what drug the person will receive, and this can be done by sealed opaque envelope system or central randomization through internet or via computer. Blinding is also important, and this is any or all of the clinicians, patients, participants, or outcome assessors are unaware of who received which intervention. This could be single blinded, double blinded, or triple blinded. Determining and delivering the intervention. The intervention should be specifically defined and consistently delivered. And the clinical expertise here is very important at this stage because they will ensure that the clinical intervention is clinically sound and safe, because it is unethical to expose the patient to unnecessary risk or to an intervention that is unlikely to have sufficient benefit. We need also at the beginning of the research to consider whether to use a placebo control or an active control. Determining and measuring the outcomes, this should be also determined at the beginning of the study, that all relevant outcomes, primary and secondary, should be identified. So to ensure that data collection tool capture all the required information and provide a statistical analysis. Determining sample size, this should be determined also at the beginning of the study, and if there is no previous studies, we can pilot the study, and statistical analysis should be also determined from the beginning. Disseminating and reporting results. This could be in form of poster or oral presentations in professional conferences or discussion via professional network, or could be publication in peer-reviewed journal. Unfortunately, reports of randomized clinical trials showed or lack of clarity, transparency, and completeness, and are rejected by many journals, resulting in a waste of time and resources that were spent to design, conducting, and reporting the study. On the other hand, if a poor manuscript is published, reader left with an inaccurate and confused picture of what and how the research was carried out, and this also will confuse if other attempts to repeat the study. Additionally, this or misleading or inaccurate findings may lead or have serious consequences and risk for the clinical decision if this subsequently carried out. So, general medical subjects have highlighted several deficiencies in reporting randomized clinical trial, which need to be addressed. In endodontics, the overall quality of reporting randomized clinical trial has been reported to be suboptimal. The most updated and validated tool to improve the quality of randomized clinical trial is the Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trial, and this consort consists of a 25-item checklist and flow diagram. And this consort assists author when preparing their manuscripts and when preparing their report, facilitating their complete and transparent reporting. And this also will help readers and editors for their critical appraisal and interpretation. Because of the nature of endodontics, in addition to report all the individual items of randomized clinical trial in several studies, it is also important to give clear and give information about the associated picture, or like radiographic, histologic, photographic, or composite figures. So the clinical and laboratory images in application, the CLIP principle, has been developed by Lang, and this is to improve the accuracy, validity, and the implication of images appearing in the scientific article. And this CLIP principle consists of 6 items. The consort statements cover the majority of the important parameters that require to be reported for randomized clinical trial, but still several items are missing, such as a list of keywords, the strength of the trial, conclusion, implication of the work on future research and clinical practice, as well as the quality of images. The preferred reporting item for randomized clinical trial in endodontics guidelines were developed by merging and by modifying and merging or integrating the consort's guidelines and the CLIP guidelines. And the objective or the aim of this project is to help authors improve the overall quality of randomized clinical trial and thus enhance the clinical decision making. So the objective of this lecture is to elucidate and describe the checklist of items to be used when reporting randomized clinical trial in endodontics. So this PRIRATE 2020 guidelines developed following guidance for developers of health research reporting guidelines. So as initial steps, the project leaders identified the need for new guidelines for endodontics, and a steering committee formed of 8 members. In addition to the project leaders, they drafted an initial checklist and flowchart using or by modifying the consort guidelines and the CLIP principles. The steering committee formed 2 groups, PRIRATE Delphi group and PRIRATE face-to-face group from across the globe. And then the steering committee invited the people or the member from Delphi group to participate in an online questionnaire to achieve consensus on the item to be included in the PRIRATE guidelines. Then this revised PRIRATE checklist and the flowchart were discussed in a face-to-face meeting during the 19th ESE Congress in 2019. After that, the steering committee modified the item based on the feedback of the face-to-face meeting, and then this checklist and the flowchart were piloted by several volunteers who drafted hypothetical manuscripts describing the randomized clinical trial, and then or following these guidelines or PRIRATE guidelines. Then finally, the PRIRATE 2020 checklist is composed of 11 sections and 58 items and a flow chart. So here is this checklist, and the first item is the title. So the phrase randomized clinical trial, this should be included in the title. So this will help indexing in database, and also will help reader to identify the type of the study. Keywords should be also added to the report, and using a method. This item is completely missing in consort checklist. Abstract of PRIRATE 2020. This should include, or the introduction of the abstract must include the rationale of the trial, and this is briefly also the objective of the study. The methodology section in the within the abstract should give only essential information about the study design and nature of the study. Also, statistical information should be given. Process of randomization process, blinding process, all of this information in or briefly. The result within the section of the abstract must describe number of participants and if there is any adverse event or side effect. And then the conclusion should give a summary of the finding with emphasis on the clinical implication. And at the end of the abstract, the funding must be mentioned, also the registration number of the study. Coming to the introduction, the scientific background should be detailed, and the rationale for the study also should be included, and the question of the study should be well formulated using the PICO framework. Coming to the methods, so details of the nature and the design of the study should be included. And also, if there is any change to the method after starting the trial, this should be also detailed. In addition to the inclusion and exclusion criteria, all the lists should be included in the methodology. And also the setting or the environment of the trial must be provided and described properly. The treatment of the intervention should also be included in details, also the control group. So the outcomes, the primary and the secondary outcomes must be described and included. Also details, if there is any change to these outcomes, should include or included in the report. Sample size, this should also included with details on how they calculated the sample size, either by using previous studies or by piloting the studies. Also the randomization and allocation concealment, this should be added in details. With the blinding process, we should give information who was blinded after assignment of the intervention. And statistical analysis, this should also be given in details regarding primary and secondary outcomes. The results, number of participants who were randomly assigned received the intended outcome must be detailed, and if there is any loss or exclusion after randomization, this should be justified. Also, date of recruitment, follow-up, study duration, all of these should be included, and the baseline demographics and clinical characteristics of the sample size must be provided. The results of each outcome, the primary and secondary outcome, must be detailed. Also, if there is any incidence of unintended or adverse effect, also should be included and describe how they manage it. In the discussion, an estimate of the overall all internal and external validity should be discussed, and the rationale for the eligibility criteria should be also explained, and an explanation of the clinical relevance of the primary and secondary outcomes must be included in the discussion, and if there is any balancing benefit or harms, this should also be provided. The implication for future research and clinical practice, this should be also included. This item is source and here added by the PRIRATE guidelines. Funding details also very important and should be detailed at the end of the conclusion, and clear statement of conflict of interest must be provided. So quality of images, this item also missing from consort, and here very important because of the nature of endodontics, and here in the items we should mention and detail everything about the equipment, software, and setting used to acquire the images. Also, the reason should be mentioned why this image is reported, the circumstances, the condition in which or under which the image were viewed, and if there is any modification to the image regarding brightness, color, smoothing, this also should be mentioned. Patient identifier must be removed completely, and the interpretation of finding from the image must be provided in the text. The legend for each image must include explanation if it is pre or intra or post treatment, and how the image were standardized over period of time. So here, this is an example how key information on the legend or the picture are provided, and here again one example how identification of the patient should be masked in the picture. So here this is the flow chart of the PRIRATE guidelines 2020. And as conclusion, that PRIRATE 2020 guidelines have been developed using a well-documented process, and it consists of a checklist of 58 items under 11 sections and the flow charts, and this will help the author to produce high quality reports for randomized clinical trial, which at the end will benefit the patient and clinical decision making. So thank you so much. If you want to go in details to this item, you can read the explanation and elaboration of PRIRATE guidelines in this link. So thank you so much. Any question or comment?
Do we now when you submit a paper to IEJ, is it compulsory now to submit the PRIRATE or the consort?
I didn't read
if
that.
It's an RCT.
I didn't read that it is compulsory, but this is the new guidelines.
But I'm sure they will Make it must be
But since
compulsory.
that time, there is no randomized clinical trial published. I have searched in internet, but since that time, I mean, it was
Because IEJ also has guidelines for publication of case reports. And there is a different guideline for that. It's called something, it's got another abbreviation.
Yeah, exactly, correct. Yeah.
But they don't, pardon?
Even case reports, they've developed new guidelines.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So I don't think you can submit case report without that. So this, I'm sure they will not accept any paper RCT
Depends on the
unless.
study design. There is certain guidelines for each study design.
Yes.
Systematic review.
or maybe depend on the journal, because this is published by the International Endodontic Journal. So if somebody want to publish there, then they have to follow
They have
this
to follow
guide-
this one.
this
Yeah, I
guideline.
believe it is a guidelines that you have to follow exactly, but you have to follow it, obviously, to get it published.
Yeah.
But you don't have to submit, it's not like the Prisma or the Consort. I think they're trying to standardize, aren't they? They're trying to standardize the quality and enhance the quality of publications. That's the aim of
Not
it.
standardized. They added some items that are missing from Consort and other guidelines.
But what I was thinking is, if you look at the difference between the two guidelines, how does this one, what are the features in this guideline that improves the reporting? I mean, as far as I can see, it improves the indexing of the paper.
Keywords.
Yeah.
They've got keywords,
Not only the indexing, also conclusion is missing completely in the
but
Consort.
every RCT has a conclusion.
Yeah, but maybe they emphasize on different things. Also the implication of the research, relevance of the clinical relevance of the research, all of this. Maybe in some reports,
Yeah.
they mention that. But other reports, they don't mention it. And here, if they use this report, then this is obligatory to follow the items.
But there was a
They
very,
improve the reporting of the images.
yes,
Yeah,
this is
this
the
is also,
clip thing, yeah.
Yeah.
There was a very interesting article in, I'm sure you know, Martin Coben.
Yes, yes.
Martin Coben published a very nice paper last year or the year before, where they looked at all RCTs in orthodontic journals, all RCTs, and they found that only 60% of them were actually RCTs. You remember that?
Yeah, I can't recall it clearly, but I remember that there's something like that.
Yeah. So in the orthodontic literature, only 60% of papers that said we have an RCT were actually RCTs.
So yeah, poor reporting.
Yeah. So I think from that point of view, this is very interesting that it will definitely improve reporting, but I thought Consort is actually very good.
It is good, but not for endodontics. Maybe.
But I was just trying to figure out, except because endodontics has a lot of images,
Yeah.
you
I
know.
think standardization, maybe apical, yeah, it's very
See how long this section in PRIRATE, it is so long.
But that's not unique of endodontics. Like many research areas, they have a lot of images, but they don't have to show the images. Like in the research, like it's not only endodontics.
Endodontists like to show their root fillings.
But in many other fields, in radiology, the research is based on image, but in the articles they don't put images.
I know dental traumatology is going to adopt the IEJ.
IEJ guidelines?
Yeah.
Dental traumatology, yes.
Over Consort? So they're not going to accept people who
I'm not
submit
sure.
with Consort?
I'm not sure if it's going to be mandatory or not, but the editor sent the other day asking if we are happy